The axe came down in the same arc it always did. Clean. Certain. The wood split without argument. Eli Cutter set the two halves aside and did it again. The mountain above him was quiet in the way mountains are quiet in October, not peaceful, exactly, but indifferent. The aspens had lost most of their leaves. What remained clung to the branches with a stubbornness he understood without thinking about it. He had been splitting wood since before first light. Not because he needed it, he had enough to last 3 winters. He split it because the motion required nothing of him. No decision. No conversation. No accounting for himself. That was the life he had built, 7 miles north of Granger, Wyoming, in a cabin above a creek with no name on any map. He had built it himself in the spring of 1867, 2 years after Appomattox, 1 year after he understood that the war hadn't ended just because someone had signed a paper. He went into town once a week. Tuesday mornings. Flour, salt, coffee, ammunition. He said what needed saying. He came home. That was the shape of his life. He had decided it was enough. He had decided wrong. Clara Ashworth arrived in Granger on the 14th of October, 1868, a Tuesday, which meant Eli was already there when the stage pulled in. He noticed her the way he noticed most things, completely, and without appearing to. She stepped down with the careful movement of someone pretending she wasn't exhausted. Carpetbag in one hand, a little girl's hand in the other. The girl pressed herself into her mother's side without a word. They stood in the street while the driver unloaded a trunk that looked like it had been repacked many times. Eli collected his order and left. He didn't think about her on the ride home. He had trained himself, years ago, not to think about things he couldn't affect. It was a skill you developed when you spent 3 years looking through a scope at men who were, in every meaningful sense, already dead. You learned to stop the mind before it went somewhere it couldn't come back from cleanly. He did not dream. He had stopped dreaming in 1864 and never asked for it back. Margaret Purcell, who ran the only boarding house in Granger with the precision of someone who'd never been given the luxury of imprecision, told Clara she could have the back room through the end of October. After that, she couldn't say. Clara thanked her and didn't ask about November. She had learned, in the year since her husband Thomas died of fever in Kansas City and left her with a 4-year-old named June and $11.40, that asking too far ahead was a way of frightening yourself into paralysis. Better to solve October. She learned the kitchen, the schedule, Margaret's preferences. She was good at making herself useful in other people's structures. On her second Tuesday she noticed the man, tall, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who work rather than men who are merely built that way, moving through the street without looking at anything unnecessary. She had seen men who looked like they were carrying something they couldn't put down. She didn't think about him again until he came into the boarding house. Eli wasn't sure what had possessed him to try the boarding house for his coffee instead of Bauer's back room where he usually sat. He came in, settled at the far end of the table. The woman from the stage came through the kitchen door, served the other guests, then turned to him. She didn't do what most people did, look at the scar on his jaw or the size of him and then look away. She looked at him the way you look at someone you're actually planning to speak to. Good morning. Coffee? Yes, Eli said. She poured it. Then, without the brightness people used when they were managing him, she simply asked, "What would you like?" Not "what can I get you?" "What would you like?" He ordered eggs and biscuits. Drank his coffee. Left a fair tip. Rode home and split wood for 3 hours without stopping. He came back the following Tuesday. And the Thursday after that. He told himself it was the coffee. She learned his name and used it without making it mean anything, not Mr. Cutter, not Eli with the weight of assumption behind it. Just, your usual, Eli? Which assumed he had a usual. Which he did by then. Which she had noticed. He heard about her situation from Carl, who mentioned it without being asked. The back room at Margaret's was going to someone else in November. Clara had been looking for 3 weeks. The town had 3 possible places, and all 3 had reasons that added up to the same reason: a young widow with no local connections, and respectable households in 1868 Wyoming had opinions about that. Eli paid for his order and left. He went home and looked at the cabin. 2 rooms, the main room with the fireplace, and a storage room in back he'd built in his 2nd year because he'd had the timber and the time. He'd never used it for anything except crates and pelts. He sat outside until dark. Then he went inside and started clearing it. He didn't plan what to say. Planning conversations was a way of ensuring they went wrong. He came in Thursday morning, earlier than usual. Clara was clearing plates. June sat in the corner with a picture book, the focused attention of someone doing important work. Eli sat down. Clara came with the coffee pot. "I have a room," he said. "Storage room, north side of the cabin. I cleared it. Window, door with a lock, stove that works." Clara set the pot down. "I know what people will say. I can't do anything about that. What I can tell you is that I've been in this county 2 years and given nobody reason to question my conduct." He looked at her. "The room would be yours. I would not be in it." "What would you want for it?" Clara asked. "Nothing." "That's not a reasonable offer." "I know. Why are you making it?" He thought about it the way he thought about everything that mattered, without rushing, without filling the silence with something careless. "Because nobody else is," he said. She said she would think about it. He nodded and left. "The following Tuesday," she said, "if the offer is still open." He said it was. She had one condition: she would cook. Not as payment, she knew the difference. And June will need her own space. "I won't put her in the same room as me if there's another way." "There's a loft," Eli said. He had not in fact considered the loft until she said it. "Storage. I can clear it." "All right." That was November 3rd. The thing about living alongside another person after years of solitude is that you cannot prepare for it. Eli made practical preparations, cleared the loft, built a short rail so June wouldn't roll off in her sleep, found blankets in a chest he hadn't opened in a year. Practical things he was good at. What he wasn't prepared for was the sound of someone else in the cabin. Not conversation. Just presence. The way the air in a space changes when it is being shared. June decided, within 48 hours, that Eli was not dangerous. Her evidence included how he moved without raising his voice, the rail he'd built on the loft, and the dog, a 3-legged shepherd mix named Scout that Eli had found caught in a trap 2 winters ago and kept, because the dog had nowhere else to go. June called him Biscuit. The dog answered to it. Eli didn't comment. Clara let him be quiet. That was the most important thing she did. Most people who witnessed his silence tried to fill it. Clara left it as if it were his, and she understood that. She cooked, cared for June, read by the fire, and said nothing that didn't need saying. He began, slowly, to talk. The weather. The traps. Scout's leg, which had healed wrong and gave him trouble in the cold. One evening in December, fire lower, June asleep in the loft, he told her Scout's name came from the war. He'd had 4 dogs, all named the same, because he hadn't wanted to get attached to individual names. Did it work? Clara asked. No, he said. No, she agreed, as if she'd expected that. It was the most he'd said about the war to anyone in 8 years. He thought it had something to do with the fact that she hadn't asked. January brought the worst of the cold, the kind that had weight and intention. One afternoon, storm outside, Clara mending by the window, Eli was oiling his rifle at the table. His own, from the war. Kept clean because some habits don't admit exceptions. Clara looked up. Was it bad? She asked. The war. Yes, he said. What did you do? He told her. Not everything. The part that mattered, sharpshooter, exceptional range, used accordingly. Numbers he had never said aloud. Distances. Confirmed. Things he had carried because there had been no one to put them in front of. She listened without looking away. When he finished, the cabin was quiet except for the wind. You've been paying for it ever since, she said. I suppose. Does it help? Being here. It helped, he said. Less than it used to. She went back to her mending. He went back to the rifle. What had been said stayed in the room, not demanding anything, just present, the way true things are once you've allowed them out. February. The cold beginning to soften in small concessions. Eli came in from checking traps to find she'd made soup from the last of the venison. Better than it had any right to be. He said so. She looked pleased in a way she usually contained better. The moment settled into silence the way their silences did now, comfortable, theirs. Clara set down her spoon. What do you want, Eli? He looked up. What do you want, she said again, not pressing, just clarifying that the question was the question. From your life. From the days. I've never once heard you say. You say what's needed. What makes sense. What ought to be done. But not what you want. He was quiet for a long time. June, across the room, was telling Biscuit something in a low voice that neither of them could quite hear. Nobody ever asked me that before, Eli said. I know, Clara said. Which meant she had noticed. Which meant she had been paying attention the whole time. He looked at his hands. At the window and the snow and the mountain. He thought about what he wanted. Not what was needed. Not what made sense. What he wanted. The answer was already there, the way answers are when you've been avoiding looking at them directly, fully formed, patient. He was not a man who said things of that kind. He went to Carl Bauer the following Tuesday and filed paperwork for a homestead addition, a proper bedroom on the east side of the cabin, separate entrance, window facing the sunrise. He paid for money saved for years because there had been nothing he wanted to spend it on. He started building in March, when the ground softened. He didn't explain why. Clara watched from the doorway the first morning and said nothing. She brought lunch at noon and coffee in the afternoon and said nothing about the dimensions or the window or the small porch taking shape between the addition and the main cabin door. On the third day June came and stood beside him. Are you building a house? She asked. Adding on. For us? He looked at her. Then at Clara, 20 yards away, who had heard, who was looking at him with the expression she wore when she was not letting herself say something yet. If you want it to be, he said. He was looking at Clara when he said it. June looked at her mother. Clara looked at Eli. She nodded once. Which was all she had ever needed to give him, and all he had ever needed to understand. He finished the addition in April. By May, the mountain had its green back, the creek loud with snowmelt, and Scout Biscuit had begun spending his nights at the foot of June's bed instead of Eli's. Eli noticed. He said nothing. There are stories that end with declarations. With words spoken in a moment designed for exactly that purpose. This was not that kind of story. In this story, a man who had spent years learning not to want things built a room so that a woman and her daughter would have somewhere to be. A woman who had spent a year learning to solve October allowed herself, slowly, to look further ahead. And a little girl called a three-legged dog by the wrong name, and the dog answered, and nobody corrected anyone, because some things are right enough just the way they are. What Eli Cutter wanted was simple. He wanted to be somewhere that needed him. Not as a sharpshooter. Not as an instrument. Not as the man the territory knew to stay on the right side of. He wanted to be needed the way you are needed when you are seen. Nobody had ever asked him what he wanted. She had. That was where it started. That was where it still was.